We are here today with Kerry Ryan. She is a curator at the M+ Learning and Interpretation team. Before joining in M+ nearly 2 years ago, Kerry worked as Director of Interpretation at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Canada. Maybe we could start by explaining the concept of M+, meaning museum and beyond. In your view, what makes M+ different from more traditional museums?
I think the best way to answer that question is to talk about first what makes it different from other museums. So M+ is a museum of art, design, and moving image, and that makes up the concept of what we call visual culture. So we're not just looking at art objects or design objects, but looking at them in conversation with their environment and with the role they've played in our lives, but also looking at them as art and design objects. And then when we take that one step further, we really want to think about how M+ engages with our audiences. So for our team, in particular the learning team, we were embedded early on in the thinking about how the museum would tell its stories. And so that really shifts a little bit of the perspective. So a traditional museum is often one direction, objects in cases or objects on the wall, and really not much fabric that connects them to the audience. So for M+, we are really looking at how can we bring in the thinking around how audiences might be part of that story. So a lot of our spaces have both traditional ways of displaying objects, but then we also flipped the conversation so that audiences are the ones giving their own interpretation, driving the content, thinking about how they might relate to the material on display. The other way M+ is a bit different is that we have a moving image center in the museum. So there's a cinema program. So we really wanted to reflect Hong Kong's connection to the film industry. So there is a real sort of sense of bringing that material into the museum. The building itself is very open, so you can come in from multiple directions, multiple sides. You can come in from the water, you can come in from the city on the Kowloon side. And so it's meant to kind of have that porousness, again, sort of collapsing some of the ideas between object and people. And so hopefully by being framed as a museum of visual culture, we're also breaking down some of the boundaries of what's considered high art, what's considered something that popular culture. So really trying to think through some of those definitions with our audiences.
You have once stressed that Hong Kong youth, and I'm referring here to generations set between 18 and 30 years old, are a key audience for M+. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the question is, we've said that young people or youth are an important priority audience for M+, and what does that mean? So when I like to think about the future of museums, and certainly a conversation we've had a lot at M+, we think about the future audiences. So young people or those who we consider sort of maybe they're in Generation Z, but those who are sort of in between school age and sort of family, having their own families. And this is a really important audience, I think, in Hong Kong for finding something that connects them into the sort of fabric of their city. So part of what we're thinking about is how do we engage that audiences? How do we make them find a connection? How do they come to the museum and see themselves reflected in what we're doing? So, and why that's sort of a bit of a challenge is because museums can often be really boring. They are kind of dry, there's not much happening, you walk in, it's quiet, people are shushing you. So the idea around M+ is to really think about how can we make people feel welcome, and in particular, how can we make that audience feel welcome. So I'm not in that age category, so I often have to think, like, what's really gonna work for this audience? So we're planning out all of our programs and our activities to think through what's a young person in Hong Kong going to connect to. So part of that is content related. So there's objects in this on display that are old. They're from, you know, the 70s and 80s. They're not from a time period where the young people have sort of, that's not what they're currently looking at. So I think it's part of how do we help make those connections for people? How do we have those audiences see the value in some of the objects we're collecting? So, because all of the objects and art that we're bringing into conversation tell a story about Hong Kong in some way. So how do we make sure that we're connecting into the sort of the thoughts and ideas that that audience is really thinking of? So one of the things we're thinking about is what types of programs will we have? So we're planning on developing some programs in collaboration with youth. So thinking through how can people who are in university come with us and join us on some program development. Are there types of events that youth would want to participate in. We're really just trying to figure out what's going to really connect with that audience. And I think for me, it's really important to hear from that audience in the shaping of the program. So I think the challenge is for them to really look at the objects, which might not seem that interesting when you first look at them, but then think about like, okay, if you were shaping this for a group of your peers, what do you think could be interesting for them? And so lots of museums have run lots of different programs. There's late night activities, there's DJs, there's art making activities, there's filmmaking activities, but it's sort of like what's gonna work here. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about opening a new museum is to see what potential there is.
My next question has to do with branding and identity. Given the variety of institutions integrated in the West Kowloon Cultural District, it does not seem easy to come up with a unified brand concept. Is the West Kowloon District trying to do so, or can we speak of M+ as a separate brand? In other words, do you see yourselves as working for M+ or for the West Kowloon Cultural District?
The question is M+, do we see ourselves as a separate brand? Is the idea that West Kowloon be part of a umbrella brand, and how do those things work together? It's a good question. I think there's a benefit of being part of West Kowloon because we're all sort of part of a district. So you can imagine that with the Hong Kong Palace Museum, with all of our performing arts venues, and then with M+, there's sort of a way for someone to kind of spend their day or try different things. Different audiences will find different things that connect, that they're attracted to or that they're connected to. And I think variety often makes something a little bit more interesting. And then we also have the ability to sort of connect with one another and make connections. So I think the cultural district is just becoming. So it's the performing arts venues are all within the last 2 years. Hong Kong Palace Museum doesn't open until next year, M+ later on this year. So it really is about how are we going to strengthen one another and how can we work together. So already we are in collaboration with the performing arts team to think about how can we bring performing arts into M+. There's always sort of a relationship between contemporary art and dance and the concept of visual culture, and how do we bridge those two things. So I think it creates some natural partnerships for us, which we wouldn't have if we were a standalone museum. On the question of branding, certainly M+ will have its own brand. It's important that the museum is known as a sort of as a museum of visual culture. It has to stand alone in that idea. So when it comes online later this year, you'll see there's a big facade facing out the Victoria Harbour, and that whole screen is an LED screen that will be activated with M+ content, including some branding, but also other sort of signifiers of M+. So I think it will mark ourselves within the district as sort of the contemporary sort of design, art, moving image space for the district. So we'll have our own website, for example, that will be a standalone M+ website and branding that's separate from West Kowloon, but we're sort of part of the West Kowloon family, and so we benefit from being in a family.
To what extent do you think it is an advantage for M+ to have such a broad visual art focus? So not only traditional visual arts, but moving image and architecture. Isn't there a risk of losing coherence and confusing people when communicating the M+ story?
I think when we open, we'll learn a lot about what material people connect to. So we have, as you said, we have visual art, we have design objects, and we have moving image. And for me, thinking about visual culture is actually about how those things tell a story together. So for me, it's actually an advantage. It's way more interesting to think about a moment in time if you can look at what film was doing, what design was doing, what art was happening, because it tells a more complete story of what people were negotiating with or what experiences were being sort of reflected in our material culture, or what artists, designers, and makers were producing. So it does have those advantages. So I think we have the benefit of going discipline specific, so being very, very art focused or very design focused, very moving image focused, but also kind of mixing things to tell stories, because I think the story is what's going to be most memorable if we can do that well. And that's the benefit of having pieces. So hopefully that will actually help tell M+'s story.
My next question has to do with your personal preferences. What are your favourite parts of the M+ art collection? What about specific artworks and why?
I really have been sort of really interested in a lot of the gutai work from the Japanese artists. It's something that wasn't that familiar to me. Art that had been made by these artists in a post-war period where they really were using their hands and their feet to just really get close and connect with the kind of process of making was a great sort of discovery for me. Of course, the SIG collection has some sort of famous or really well-known contemporary Chinese artworks, so I've read about those for a long time coming from working in an art museum, so it was really exciting to discover we had a lot of those works in our collection. I think it's interesting because I haven't actually managed to see any of M+'s collection in person yet, so all my comments are based on research or little thumbnail images on the collection's beta, much like what everyone else will get to see.